Okay, there we go. Perfect. Hi, everyone. um, yeah, so we already did my introduction. So let me quickly mention Polypane. So I also saw someone just ask, what is Polypane? So Polypane is an app or a browser for web developers that lets you develop sites at multiple viewports at the same time. So what you can see here is that I've opened the Mintbean website on way too many screen sizes. And anything I do in one of these happens in all of them. So if you're designing or developing a website, it becomes really easy to see how the changes that you're making affect all the different screen sizes. So beyond that, it also has a ton of tools for accessibility, like color blindness simulators, or I'm currently working on a readability overlay that will tell you which of the sentences on your site are hard to read. So you can rewrite them to make them easier. And just like all sorts of tools in that area. There's like meta previews for your social media. So you can see how your site is going to look when it's shared on Twitter, etc. So Polypane is a paid product. There's a free trial, but it's also free for students through the GitHub Student Developer Pack. So if that's interesting to you, check out education.github.com for more information. Besides Polypane, there's also another app that I'm working on called Superposition. Superposition is a free app that will let you extract color styles and other design tokens from existing websites. And then you can re-export that into CSS and Sass, but also with plugins into Adobe XD and Figma. So you can point Superposition to one of your sites or a site that you're basing stuff on, and then use the same colors and the same fonts in the design that you're working on so that you can always stay consistent. So you can find that on superposition.design. So with that out of the way, let's get to ground rules for responsive design. Now, before I want to start talking about what are these ground rules, I want to focus on the other part of the sentence first, which is responsive design. So I think most of you or some of you will be familiar with responsive design already, but I wanted to get a definition up on screen anyway. So responsive design is the way a website adapts to different screen sizes or user preferences or even user surroundings by reflowing, restyling, and repositioning content as the space on screen allows. So initially, when responsive design came out, this meant that you could resize your site to fit the device it's being shown on. And that's what we'll focus on the most today. However, in recent years, we've also had new capabilities in browsers that are currently being called user preference media queries that will let users configure stuff like that they prefer dark mode or that they prefer reduced motion. For example, if they have a vestibular disorder or get dizzy when there's a lot of motion on screen. So with these things, we can be even more responsive, not just to whatever device a site is being shown on, but actually responsive to what the user wants from you. So I think that's really interesting. In this talk, we'll mostly discuss the size aspects, though. So responsive design is being done with, or you do that with breakpoints, and they look like this. You have add media in your CSS, and then you add a certain property that you want to check against. And basically, these are like if statements, like if the width is wider than 30 ems, then apply the CSS in this block between the curly braces. So there are a ton of different media queries. Honestly, way too much to go into today. So if you want to read more about that, I wrote a huge article, which is available at bit.ly slash all media queries, where I really go from like the syntax to how it has changed over the years to what the features are now, how they like how you can set them in browsers, and then also like what new media queries we can expect in the future, because this is always evolving and we're always getting more media queries to play with, which is really exciting to me. So back to the ground rules. So why do we need ground rules? We need ground rules because CSS is a complex system, and without rules, it can become hard to determine the result of your CSS and impossible to make changes without accidentally breaking things on other sizes that you're not considering at that moment. And obviously, we don't want stuff to break. So with a set of simple to follow ground rules, you can make your site much more robust and also easier to reason about as you work on it. So I have 9 rules, and we'll just go through them one by one. So the first is keep your viewport simple. The viewport meta tag is a meta tag that goes into your HTML, and it tells your browser how to render your site. The viewport that's on the screen right now that says width equals device width tells your browser that your site has been built responsively, and that it knows that it will use the available space and fit and won't break. Now, when you go look at examples of viewports on the internet or on Stack Overflow or whatever, you'll find a lot of other things being put into this content bit as well. Things like user-scalable is no, initial scale is 1, minimum scale, maximum scale. For the sites you're working on today, none of these are actually needed, and some are actually harmful. So user scalable no, for example, completely blocks the user from zooming in on your website. Of course, even if you have the perfectly designed website that looks great on your mobile phone, there are people that will still want to zoom in on that site just to make things more readable. So the last thing you want to do is block them from scaling your website. And in fact, recent versions of iOS and Android have started ignoring this bit. So even if you say user scalable is no, your phone is just going to ignore it. So you can leave it out and end up with a better website. So the first rule is very easy. Keep your viewport simple. Just say width is device width, and you're good to go. When you develop a responsive website, there are really 2 ways to do it. Either you first build the desktop view and you work your way down, or you first build the mobile view and you work your way up. Mobile first is the better of the 2 options. For those of us that have been building websites for longer, starting at the desktop is just how we've always done it, because we haven't always had cell phones and responsive design. And also, you're working on the desktop already, so it feels natural to start there. But mobile first is better and easier because mobile layouts are easier. On mobile, things fall into just a single column, which is what HTML naturally does anyway. So if you write an HTML page and have no styling whatsoever, it will be perfectly responsive and it will be a single column. So you need to add very little code to get the layout you want on mobile. You don't need to add any complex columns or layouts to make the design fit. The mobile code is going to be very simple. And then as you scale up, as you get wider screens, you only need to add code to add layout. However, if you do it the other way around, if you start with a desktop, you start with all this code for multiple columns and layouts and alignment and whatever. And then as you scale down, you have to add even more code to counteract the code you've already written. You have to undo the work you've already done to make it work on smaller screens. And if you're not careful undoing things correctly, you end up with broken layouts on mobile because they'll be too wide. So if you build websites mobile first, you save quite a chunk of code you don't have to write in the first place, which is great. And the default layout will also never break on wider screens because it's already made or already written to fit that single column. If the column gets wider, it still won't break. For number 3, you want to design from the content out. Responsive design is usually linked to devices. In fact, the previous rule I mentioned is designed for mobile first. But what I actually meant was start with the smallest width. When you optimize specifically for devices, things are going to break the moment the next wave of devices come out. So when the average width of mobile phones went from 320 pixels to 375 pixels, suddenly all designs were a little too wide. But newer designs simply didn't work on that 320 pixel because developers didn't test on that anymore. They all got like the new iPhone and the new Android, and they were huge. And they just sort of forgot, like many developers sort of forgot about 320. It's still important. A lot of people still use that 320 pixels wide. And the same thing is going to happen now that we're going from 375 for most cell phones to 414 pixels for most cell phones. So the way to deal with this is to not design for device sizes specifically, but to design based on the content. And there's an author called Stephen Hay who describes it as following. You start with a small screen, then you expand until it looks like shit. His words, not mine. And that's when you know it's time for a breakpoint. So you really look at the content of your site and what the content needs. So if the line length gets really wide, then you probably need a new breakpoint. But otherwise, try to use the median. So when you add breakpoints based on when your content needs it, the design will automatically fit on the devices, since the content will fit on any size between those. If, like from rule 3, device widths no longer matter, you also don't have to use their pixel sizes for your breakpoints. And you can switch over to ems. Now, ems are a unit in CSS that are dependent on the text size. And if we use ems for our breakpoints, that brings us a number of benefits. So the big benefit is that when your user has a different base font size, you can configure this in your browser, or they've zoomed in the site, your breakpoints will automatically switch over, so your layout never breaks. Whereas if you use pixels, that's going to be separate from the font size. So you're going to end up with fonts or text that is either too large or too small for the breakpoints that is currently being shown at. With ems, all of that just magically works. Now, it might be difficult to reason in ems as you start out, because you might be familiar with pixels already and have a certain feel for how wide something is. Like you can look at something and you can estimate like this is about 500 pixels. And you can also look at that and then don't know how much ems that is, because that's not a unit you've associated with lengths up until now. 1 em for a regular browser is 16 pixels. And it's really just a matter of using it and getting used to it. Giovanni, that's right. So Uh, right. So if you use amps, you're going to have to adjust a little bit to like this new way of thinking about widths. But if you build on the other two rules, mobile first and design from the content out, it becomes actually much easier to reason about because you can just go through to like the size that fits, figure out how wide your text is, and then use that value for your amps. Responsive design, as we've mentioned, can get very complex. So when you have media queries using both min width and max width, it becomes nearly impossible to tell which CSS rules are active at which sizes because they can overlap. Like a certain min width can start before another certain max width, and you have this weird in-between bit where both rule sets or both CSS is being applied. And those things can get very hairy. If, however, all your media queries go up or down, you always know where to look when your site doesn't work as you expect. Because CSS in new media queries will never influence the styles of earlier media queries. Again, you're only building up. Between the two, min width is the easier to work with when you also do mobile first design. But for this rule specifically, it's really all about using one or the other consistently and not mixing them. It can be very tempting to use fixed elements or fixed dimensions for elements. After all, the design you get all have fixed elements, and those values are easy to copy from your design tool or your handoff tool. But elements with fixed dimensions can break your layout easily, especially narrow viewports. If you, for example, forget to add or to compensate for that on smaller devices. But instead of using fixed dimensions, try to style elements in the relation to their surrounding. Use percentages or viewport units and prevent setting width and height directly. Instead, try to use min width and max width, or even the CSS calc function along with percentages. That will give you a much more resilient layout that doesn't depend on fixed dimensions that you then have to overwrite for smaller and smaller sizes. In tandem with that, use modern layout techniques. Between Flexbox and Grid, very often you don't even need to write media queries or define sizes to create responsive layouts. Flexbox and Grid are both built to be inherently flexible and size elements according to their surroundings. Now, getting into these layout systems specifically is too much for this presentation, but if you're not yet familiar with them, definitely seek out some resources. When you build content out and mobile first, it can be tempting to add media queries right at the point where a line looks nice to get that like pixel perfect look. But of course, we know the web is not pixel perfect. One of the fundamental reasons for that is that text rendering differs per browser and per operating system. So that pixel perfect line break on your device could very well look off on another computer that just happens to have a slightly different rendering engine. Instead, try to leave a little slack in your media queries. Don't add a new media query right at the point where the text lines on your device change, but add a few pixels, like 5 or 10, or maybe even 20. That way, you leave space for things to be off by a few pixels between browsers, and that will save you a lot of cross-browser frustration. Lastly, if you follow all these rules, it doesn't make sense to design all the breakpoints in a design tool. On the other hand, designing everything in the browser is very difficult as well. So what's the happy middle ground? Well, here's what I think. You start with creating designs in a design tool with rough responsive variants for mobile, tablet, and desktop. But you keep the choice of when to switch from one design to another to when you're actually working in the browser. So as an example, your artboard may be 750 pixels wide, but if you're in the browser and the layout already makes sense at 44 ems, which is 704 pixels, then make that switch at 44 ems. Don't wait until 750 pixels. Decide in the browser. So these were my 9 ground rules for responsive design, but of course I have one more, which is please give Polypane a try. With Polypane, using these ground rules and creating sites and apps in a mobile first and content out way is very natural because you start with a single small pane or viewport, design your site in there, then you add a new one, you stretch it until the layout breaks, you add a breakpoint, you design that until it looks great, and you do it again and again until you've gone from mobile to desktop in a way that makes your site look great everywhere. So you can check it out at polypane.com. Please check it out. And those are my 10 ground rules for responsive design. Keep your viewport simple. Start with the narrowest width or start mobile first. Design from the content out. Let the content dictate where your breakpoints happen. Use ems in your media queries because they'll size along with whatever user preferences your user has set. Use min width or max width, but don't use both. Avoid fixed dimensions when you're writing CSS. Use modern layout techniques like Flexbox and Grid when you're creating layouts because they're inherently responsive and flexible. Leave room for text rendering differences so that you don't get nasty surprises in cross-browser situations. And lastly, decide in the browser. Design in a design tool, but leave all the specific width choices to when you're working in the browser and make the choice there. So let me know what you think. Let me know if you have any questions. I can be found on kilianvelkov.com. I can be found on Twitter under @KilianVelkov, and I'm happy to answer any questions or remarks.
Thank you, Killian. That was awesome. Really like the fact that you broke that down so well. How are you doing on time?
I can stick around for a little bit.
Okay, perfect. Guys, feel free to either unmute yourselves or drop your questions in the chat, whatever you feel comfortable doing. Love to kind of hear what I know some of you have been working with responsive design for the first time, and some of you might have experimented with a little bit more. So love to kind of see what questions you have for Killian.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Did we have to raise our hands?
That's okay.
Go
Okay.
ahead.
Okay. Oh, shoot. Oh my gosh. Sorry, I forgot my question. I just suddenly got really nervous. Sorry.
No problem. Maybe Giovanni raised his hand.
Yeah, thanks. I just have a question about how would you define adaptive design and responsive design? Like, what are the difference between both? Because sometimes I get confused about the terminology. Thanks.
Yeah, so I don't think they really mean anything. Both have been used like in the past decade. So responsive design is actually, it's 11 years old yesterday. Yesterday it was 11 years old. And both responsive design and adaptive design have been used like interchangeably, but also as like marketing terms, like we do responsive design, but no, we do adaptive design because, you know, that also sounds cool. I don't really think it matters. I think responsive design as a term one, I think there are like a bunch of people that say, yeah, well, adaptive design is like you don't have one website, but you have like a specific design for mobile. And so I don't think that model was good to begin with. You do want one website that just scales to different sizes. So like in short, I don't think it really matters. I think responsive design is the term you should be using. And like anyone that tells you differently is probably doing some sort of marketing. Uh, yeah, so that's something to keep in mind.
Thanks.
Molly?
Okay, I remember my question. Sorry. Is there any particular area of responsive design that you feel like is the most overlooked with web developers?
So I wouldn't say it's overlooked, but I think that the user preference media queries are actually going to make much more of a difference. Things like color scheme, prefers reduced motion, prefers data, which is coming to browsers very soon. But also things like forced contrast, prefers contrast. All these things will let you adapt your site to users' needs, regardless of the device they're on. And what we see is that very few websites use these user preferences already, because they're very hard. It's very hard to create empathy for what they do if you don't need like reduced motion or increased contrast. And it's also not something customers ask for yet. Like responsive design really just got started because people wanted a mobile site, but they didn't want to pay for, a second site, which was up to that point the dominant way to do that. So I think, yeah, those user preferences are really like the next stage in front-end web development.
That was very insightful. There's a couple of questions from Kyle and Bowden, but before we get to Kyle and Bowden, there's a question in chat. Thoughts on Chrome's new container queries? How might one anticipate changes for their workflow or addition changes to these rules?
Right. So I haven't done a lot with container queries yet. They're supported in Polypane. However, they are so new that the rules around container queries are literally changing every week. So if you learned everything there is to know about container queries 2 weeks ago and you created an awesome demo, today it's broken. And also, while Chrome and Polypane can show container queries, none of the tooling is in place yet. So if you look in your DevTools, for example, you won't see any container query. So I think it's going to have a huge impact, but I also think right now is too soon. Right now it's like interesting for people that are very close to browsers and specifications to play around with and maybe influence some of the ongoing work there. So for now, I don't see a lot of changes to workflows yet. There's no support yet in browsers like Safari and Firefox. That will be like probably months, if not years out. So super exciting, but isn't going to change anything in the near future.
Interesting. Let's go with Kyle and then Bowden.
Thanks. I just had a question, and my understanding may be a little skewed, just about when you were saying about sizing things using the EM measurement, like so that
yeah,
like one EM would be like 16 pixels. I guess is that like kind of if like you would use like REM if you had like changed the size of like in your parent element with an EM, like EM would go off the parent element
yeah.
size,
So
you use REM
yeah, so I kind of skipped over that just for time's sake, but at the top level where your media queries are being evaluated, a rem or an rem is the same as an m, because a rem is a root m. So it's whatever the m is on the root. The reason I want you to use m's and not rems is one, it's one letter less, so you save some typing. But also rem behaves differently in Safari, but it behaves incorrectly, whereas m's behave correctly. So that's why for media queries specifically, I recommend m's.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Bowden?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. My question is, what can you say about using CSS frameworks, grid systems to make responsive design? Or it's better to just use plain CSS? Thank you.
Whatever works for you. I personally don't use frameworks a whole lot. But if you use a framework, you know that that layout system is being used by thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of other developers, and it's definitely battle tested. The only thing I would say there is make sure you use an up-to-date framework that uses things like Flexbox or Grid, and not frameworks that use float-based grid systems. So like whatever works for you, it's not one or the other isn't better. If you feel more comfortable using something like Bootstrap, using something like Tailwind, go for it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. Those were some pretty fantastic questions. I'm just going to give me 1 second. Perfect. Killian, where did you go? There you are. Thank you so much for coming on. Really enjoyed that conversation. We would love to have you back. Actually, I really want to hear from you guys and see if you guys want more on responsive design. I think when it comes to developers particularly, there's not that many conversations that happen around design and the things that, you know, one needs to consider. Like I said in the comments, when we built Mintbean, we didn't consider building it mobile first. And that actually did cost us a lot when it came to just resource and time allocation and removing elements and removing components. And it was tricky, like code was breaking everywhere and it was messy. And, you know, in hindsight, we maybe would have gone the other way, but would love to hear if you guys want more on this topic. And Killian, if you're interested in coming back and maybe taking a deeper dive on certain subjects, I know it's a very broad topic, so maybe like come back if you're interested and do more workshops on this. We'd value it.
Absolutely.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Again, enjoy the rest of your Wednesdays and look forward to seeing you in the Mintbean community. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.